good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as ever. Welcome to the latest FIPP webinar. And for today's session, we're delighted to be working with Piano, one of the world's leading content monetization technology platforms. And with Piano, we're going to be looking at one of the many digital subscription success stories powered by their technology. In this case, the UK's DMG Media, which is publisher of titles such as the Daily Mail and the New Scientist. Now, I'm going to introduce our guests for today's session in a moment, but before I do that, some very quick housekeeping items. These sessions do thrive on the interactivity between the guests and the audience, so please do use this opportunity to ask questions. You can do that using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, which you can find more or less there. You can also upvote other people's questions on there, and we'll be asking the best ones at the end of the session. So do stay tuned at the end to hear those questions and those answers. Do also keep an eye on the chat tab, which you can also find at the bottom of your screen, as the FIPP team will be posting some useful links in there throughout the session. A reminder also that if you've not already done so, to sign up for the FIPP newsletter. It is absolutely the best way to keep abreast of the latest industry news and features, FIPP special reports, and of course our events and webinars. You can sign up at the website fipp.com, and it is of course free to sign up. Now, this session is being recorded, and you'll be able to find the video on our YouTube channel, FIPP World, in the coming week. Make sure you check out the other great videos on there from previous sessions. We've got over 100, I think, by now on there. It's definitely worth having a look around the library. But now it's time for me to introduce my guests for today. Firstly, your host for today's session is Rupert Knowles. He heads up Piano's fast-growing operation in the UK and has worked in and around the digital media business for over 15 years, having previously been with Adobe. And he'll be in conversation with Harry Fawkes, head of digital subscriptions at DMG Media. Now, Harry joined DMG after 5 years at TI Media, later Future, having worked across multiple digital brands and revenue models, including launching Decanter's successful paywall Decanter Premium. And now Harry is helping to build subscription business plans, products and team functions for The Knowledge, Mail Plus, and the recently acquired New Scientist, all of whom are at very different stages of their digital journey. I'll be back later to field your questions to Rupert and to Harry. But in the meantime, a big warm welcome to both of you, and Rupert, over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Let me just share my screen about some numbers that matter, and then we will go into a conversation with Harry. Now, numbers that matter. Now, obviously, there are many numbers that matter, like 3.14, for example, is an important number. But for subscription businesses, there are different numbers, and we will look at some of those. Now, we are able to work out or get a good idea of what numbers do matter based on our many customers and the many different page views and subscriptions that we manage. So at the moment, we're tracking around 37 billion page views every month. We have the privilege of managing over 8 million subscriptions for our various clients, powering 7.5 billion content recommendations, and that gives us tremendous insight into which strategies work, which particular techniques have an effect. And in this short presentation, we'll be talking about 9 numbers, 9 stats for subscription success. And a lot of this really is around treating every customer journey as unique. So treating every customer in unique ways, being able to drive them down that conversion funnel, being able to always show the next best action, whether that next best action is around acquisition, how can we get them to become more engaged, get them to become known, get them to become a subscriber, but also, of course, importantly, also around retention, and we'll touch on that as well. So what are the next best actions to make sure that that customer stays loyal to us and doesn't churn? So without further ado, let's go to number 1, the first number. So again, this is some simple tactics you can think about and you can test within your own publications. And one of the trends we've seen that does work, is quite effective, it's quite simple to do, is the idea of a decoy pricing offer. And in our research, that can lead to a 106% increase in revenue. And this is the idea of putting a maybe a 2-year offer. So if you're currently offering a monthly and an annual, that addition of that more expensive, the premium, the longer term offer can often help drive and increase the average sale price. So trying to drive people towards that middle option. So it could be the annual, for example, and you might highlight that in a different color to indicate that that's the default offer. And this is a sort of similar concept you might see on that wine list where you have that very expensive bottle, all those expensive wines, and people tend to gravitate, maybe not necessarily to the cheapest end, but they'll gravitate somewhere in the middle. So testing and introducing those sorts of ideas can be an effective way of driving up the average revenue for those subscribers. The other thing that, again, could be very effective is trying to drive registration. So when you're thinking about subscriptions, it's about getting customers to move along that journey, to take steps towards subscribing. And one of the most important steps we see is moving from anonymous to known. So creating an account. And typically somebody who registers is 10 times more likely to become a subscriber. So any strategies you can put in place, any incentives, encouragement you can put in place to get people to register, maybe limited access to some content, maybe extra certain benefits, maybe metered access to some content, can all benefit and all help drive people along that journey. So try and drive that conversion to registered users. Very effective. The other important thing is to try and push people towards annual subscriptions. They're typically 65% more likely to renew after year one than monthly subscriptions. Now, there are obviously a number of reasons. People who are on monthly subscriptions have 12 times more opportunities to churn than somebody on an annual subscription. And obviously somebody who is committed to a year is, a bit more dedicated to that particular brand, but we know that they're much more likely to stay. So if you can incentivize people by either discounting the annual or promoting it in different ways, then any tactic you can do to drive people away from the monthly towards the annual can be beneficial. And hopefully, increase retention rate for those particular customers. So think about the type of options. If you're not offering annual subscriptions today, then it's definitely worth thinking about, or 6 monthly or even longer periods, obviously are also beneficial as well. Certainly in the early days of subscriptions, we saw a lot of publishers were almost shy to promote their paid offering. I think that's changing slowly, and certainly being bold and being very clear in your value proposition and stopping the customer as they're going through your site can be very effective. And we see here a 283 time higher conversion rate for hard stops versus, say, a pop-up ribbon at the bottom, for example. So stopping customers in their journey, making those call to actions very clear for the customer can lead to greater success. So don't be shy in showing those offers. I think there are often on screen, there are many competing messages. And if you could make the particular action you want that customer to take more bold and more obvious, then that's worth investigating. So thinking about positioning, think about the messaging, and think about, don't be shy of promoting your subscriptions. Next, on this one, we've got 2 numbers. Well, the first one is this idea of paid trial versus free trial. We see a 13% average increase in retention rate when customers switch to paid trial. And this can be a nominal amount. It could be £1, for example, or maybe just a discounted period for the initial thing. But we see a much higher, well, not much higher, but 13% retention rate at the end. So, think about switching off from free trials towards paid trials. And even though the number of people that might take that up is lower, the actual retention rate makes up for that in terms of the revenue. Because there's an 86% average first month retention rate with paid trials. People are much more likely to retain. A lot of people might take out the free trial and then they'll immediately cancel and not renew and not move on to that paid portion or the full price package after that. And there are other tactics you can think about having, maybe a longer term trial. And typically we'd recommend doing trials on monthlies and then doing discounts on annual. There's not a huge amount of value of doing trials necessarily on sort of annual products, for example. Next one is more around retention. And here we're saying we optimize the journey for new customers. So optimize the experience that they get when they join. If you work on that, it can result in a 800% higher lift over the first quarter by the end of year 2. And what we mean by this is provide that onboarding journey. So when somebody becomes a customer, remind them of the benefits of that subscription. So once they're converted, don't just leave them be. Send them emails or prompts on screen, ask how they're getting on, remind them of all the benefits that they're going to be getting through that subscription. So continue that communication, and it's important to avoid those customers becoming what we call sleepers, i.e. not benefiting from their subscribing and then forgetting about it. And by having those strategies in the first few months of that subscription can be incredibly beneficial for the long-term value of that customer. So that's something to consider and build into your strategy, not just the acquisition, but also the retention. Another good strategy, especially if advertising revenue is important for you, is to look at showing messages to people who are running ad blockers. So people who aren't showing any adverts on your site, obviously, if they're running that, you're not getting any revenue from them. But actually, we see people who disable an ad block 10 times more likely to convert when they turn off their ad blocker. Because people who turn off their ad blocker are showing a commitment and engagement to the brand. They're taking an action. They obviously really value the content because they've gone to the effort of turning off the ad blocker. And again, being able to target that group of users, being able to provide in that ad block message various options. Please, Mr. Customer, either turn off your ad blocker or maybe consider registering, or perhaps even a subscription offer on that message can be a good way of encouraging engagement and certainly identifying a certain propensity, loyalty around that particular user. So think about those sorts of strategies as well when you're communicating to your customer. It can be a good way to start that conversation when they land on your site. And I think this is the final one here, and this is 34.2% of churn is passive. However, passive churners make up half of all winbacks. So there's a distinction between passive churn and active churn. Passive churn is typically defined as people who don't go out of their way to cancel, but their payment method fails, or they don't renew their credit card expiry number, for example. So those are people, and effectively it just expires and they never get around to updating it. Whereas active churn are people who go out of their way to actually make a cancellation. Now, the passive churn, you can, although it doesn't make up the biggest proportion, it's 34%, it's a much higher percentage of the winbacks. And you can use strategies to, for example, you can do grace periods when their payment method fails, do retries over a period of time. You often see a sort of 10 to 15% win back on the first retry, or remind the customer that their payment method is about to expire, or encourage them to use methods like PayPal, for example, where customers tend to keep their PayPal cards up to date, and it can be set up so that if one card fails, it'll move on to the next card, for example, in their system. So there are various tactics you can use there to move those passive churners, or to recover those passive churners as well. So think about those sorts of strategies. Think about those, how you can recover those passive churns, as well as obviously think about those active churns as well. When somebody disables auto renew, for example, then what sort of tactics can you put in place to try and encourage them to stay as well? So those are 9 simple steps you can take to try on your different sites, and different strategies there. But certainly from our statistics, they can have demonstrable benefits to publishers. Piano publishes a range of different articles, from the sorts of things that you've just seen, right through to looking at the demise of third-party cookies, looking at the effect of COVID, for example, on subscription strategies, and you can read more about that at resources.piano.io, or you can scan that QR code there if you want to find out more information. But there's a whole load of industry articles there, and also a whole set of statistics as well that you can have a look at. Okay, so with that being said, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And we'll now switch to introducing you to Harry Fawkes, who is Head of Digital Subscriptions at TMG Media. Welcome, Harry. How are you today?
Hi, Rupert. I'm good, thanks.
Good. So first of all, I'd just like to start by tell us a little bit about your current role, and some of the projects that you're working on, because I know you're involved with several different publications at Daily Mail Group.
Yeah, so obviously the Daily Mail Group's well known for the Mail brand, but has been diversifying their portfolio away from just that specific brand in recent times. So last year they bought out the Eye, and earlier this year they bought out the New Scientist, and they're starting to fund more creative and other brands to start from scratch. So they're on the journey of changing away from that. And so at the moment I'm looking at the Eye, which is very much a centrist paper, quick, no political slant, trying to get straight to the point. Then the Knowledge, which is by the founder of the week, John Connell, and he's coming into it for his first digital experience, but very well written roundups of weekly news. And then a little bit with the Mail products, which are a little bit more in flux because they've organically grown up into a wide spread of different products, but all under a single Mail brand, but perhaps not representative at this point in time. And then the New Scientists, which are a recent acquisition, who are already miles ahead on their journey, aiming at 100,000 subscribers this year, mix of print and digital. And one of the big growth topics have been around as people take more interest in science, global warming, and their own health. So lots more to come as well.
It's a really interesting portfolio and very varied. I mean, some of those have very established brands with a large set of existing subscribers, but like the New Scientist, others obviously are newer initiatives as well. So it must be quite interesting. And prior to that, I know you were at at Decanter, which I think has moved about through different brands. I think it was its future was TI. And then before that as well. So how does it compare? Well, you cut your teeth at Decanter, I believe, didn't you, on subscriptions? Yeah,
exactly. So then I was on a digital exec board at TI Media for a bit, and that changed so many times. I think we changed once a year. People might know it's IPC, Time Inc., TI Media, Meredith for 2 weeks, now Future. Of those brands, you can have everything from Trusted Reviews, which is an affiliate or e-commerce-led proposition, to Horse and Hound, which you might know from Notting Hill, to Decanter, which is about wine. So we had a lot of options to trial programmatic advertising, go for scale, go for affiliates, go for paywalls. And because we had so many brands, paywalls naturally had a natural fit with specialist publications. And Decanter had taken over programmatic revenue within 9 months, based on how that played out. So it was a very strong fit with Decanter.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is this distinction, isn't there, between general interest publications and more specialist, where perhaps it's harder to get that sort of information in other places. I think the classic example people often talk about is the Financial Times, where if I want to get that very specific financial information as part of my job, I almost need to go there. And I guess so in some ways Decanter, if I really want that industry knowledge around wine, I would have to turn to something like Decanter for that. Whereas perhaps the Knowledge or the Eye is I guess quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, my starting point is always that you have either a social transaction or a financial transaction that is driving any reason why you'd interact with a brand or a paywall. And Decanter is a perfect mix of both, where you score wines, and because you're going to pay a lot of money for those wines, you need to de-risk that purchase. So you'll happily part with X amount of money to get that information to see what's the best. And the same played out in different magazines. For example, Horse and Hound. People seem to want to pay for veterinary advice, and if you think about the same reason, treating horses costs a lot of money. So getting the best advice, it's not much to be engaged in that community. So it's finding those niches that people are happy to pay for. But again, there's a whole social side to Horse and Hound or Decanter around eventing or drinking wine, where you don't want to look like, let's face it, a plonker when you take a bottle round to your friends. So they're kind of de-risking that in a social situation, and that plays out across other brands. So you see that across New Scientist, and Economist. A lot of those people are there for social reasons. I can't tell you the amount of friends who say they subscribe to both. Are they scientists and economists? No, they're not. But it's something to be in the loop with. And I think the same is true with The Guardian. They've got mass scale, but then as you said, the FT, if you look at their page views, is much less. But that knowledge that people want, there's a social side and a transactional side to that. So it's hitting that perfectly.
And how would you approach those? I mean, in terms of the strategies you deploy for a general interest versus a specific interest publication, how would they differ between those two types of publications you're talking about?
Well, I think ultimately, and I've said to editors here, people in different stages of their journey, and editors from print backgrounds very much know their audience and know what they want to drive. And data-driven decisions is not naturally in their way of thinking. But the best does rise to the top very quickly. If you're looking at page view metrics, it's probably the wrong thing. So, for example, you could get 100,000 people to read a story on the top 10 Prosecco's. Would anyone pay to read that? No. But you could get a story that have 1,000, and you'd get 100 people to sign up, paying 100 quid a year. So just looking at those metrics, trying to work out what the things are that work for you are all important. So on the eye, we've just launched a registration journey. We've already got an editorial dashboard about what people are clicking to register on. And within a week, we're having clear signals of what's going to the top already. Across one of the other mail products, there is a clear winner. Now, the editorial team perhaps don't want to acknowledge what's doing well because their own opinion clashes with that, but there are clear winners coming through, and the knowledge as well, the same sort of content. And you see that play through in marketing, just both from organic publishing, but marketing as well, and how people perceive your brand. So
yeah, and it's interesting that shift towards chasing the volume. It's moved away for a lot of publications, away from a volume game, away from trying to maximize your number of eyeballs, maximize the audience size, and actually far more, I think, on quality, and maybe a slight shift away from clickbait, and focusing a little bit more on those quality articles to help drive revenue. And I think we've seen that change in your years working around subscriptions. What are the other sorts of changes that you've seen in the industry?
Well, I think firstly, the success has been shouted out so much. People like the Washington Post and New York Times have always been leaders, and they've been going for 10 years. So you've got to remember that if you're a startup, and it's not a quick payback, it is a long-term investment piece. But behaviors towards subscriptions, car buying is moving towards subscriptions. The whole mentality is coming over. The US propensity to subscribe were much higher, and now that's becoming a thing in the UK. The quality of journalism, I say, going away from page views to, one of the best goals at Decanter, or milestones that we had, was going to a contributor and paying her more money to write more long content because it was performing on the paywall, and not because it was in the magazine, and not because it was driving page views, but because you knew that people were engaging with long form reports. So suddenly she was back on a plane to Bordeaux, to America, to taste. And those, that quality of journalism starts to feed through, and that cycle is sped up. And you're seeing that in commissioning in some of the bigger titles as well.
Yeah, no, it's been some interesting trends, and I think that sort of idea as well of the overbearing advertising as well. We're seeing slightly less, where I take over your entire homepage with flashing auto video start adverts as well. I think that's diminishing as well a little bit as people are realizing they need to think about the quality of their product. If they expect people to pay for it, it's some a focus on the quality there.
It's an interesting business conversation that you don't always win at the start, where you can say, okay, let's turn off all our adverts from the homepage, and someone will say, well, our cost per 1,000 on this is this amount, so we have to front load it, and it doesn't really matter about the experience. But as soon as you're going away to quality, then it does start to lend it to doing that, and it makes it very hard for some brands to change. But you do see it come through, and you do see those experiences come through. I think AMP as well, GDPR coming through, and that shift from programmatic. You've got all these different things come up. You talked about the end of third-party cookies. If I was in a programmatic agency now, and some of the lawsuits out there are trying to draw up a 5-year plan off that would be, interesting.
Yeah, indeed, and we've certainly seen a lot of conversations around the demise of third-party cookies, and again, Google have changed their stance again, and it's almost do you want to be at their beck and call? Do you want to be driven by what Google decide to do, or actually do you want to put your own strategy in place around that? I think you're right. Brands are going to progress at different speeds depending on where they are and depending on what they're offering. And I think some of those tensions that we saw between those drive for advertising, which is often chasing audience numbers, versus the subscription business, I think some of those are easing, and I think that a lot of brands, I think, are finding a balance between those two.
It is worth making that point that when we launched Decanter, our page views went up, and the reason why is because we knew that 1% of our audience were the ones that we're going to convert, so the other 99%. By nature of investing, were coming, so our page views went up based on the paywall model we chose. So it isn't one or the other. There is a happy blend you can choose between them, because, for example, we've turned off an advertiser user on the eye, but the amount of people going through in the overall scheme of things is so small that it won't even impact their programmatic revenue.
Do you, I don't know, and it's not something you may measure, but do you look at people who are running, one of the things I brought up was around people running ad blockers. Is that something that you have looked at or have strategies around today?
Well, obviously it's built into Piano, and it depends on the audience you have. The older the audience, generally ad blockers are not an issue. But for example, on trusted reviews, where you're making your money from affiliate revenue, ad blockers are a big problem, because you've got a younger audience, much more likely to understand what that software is. So there are case studies where if you literally ask them to turn it off with a support this publisher message, you can get quite a few people to turn them off at that point, because most of them haven't made the connection between that publisher runs off revenue, someone has to pay them ultimately, and just by reminding them that as a soft prompt is enough to allow them to do that.
Yeah, I think the worst offenders are tech publications, where they've got a very tech savvy audience, and they seem to be the ones that have the biggest issue and perhaps have the most to gain from putting those strategies in place. I think those younger audiences are also interesting, and I remember speaking to somebody about this, saying, well, actually the younger people are often most prepared to pay for subscriptions. They're the ones that have grown up with the Netflix and the Spotifys. For them, it's just another subscription service. It's not novel. Whereas, maybe people of another generation are, well, I've always got my news through the web for free. Why should I pay for it now? So I think that you can look at audiences in different ways, but I think that acceptance, as you say, of a whole range of different services being delivered through subscriptions is becoming more of the norm.
Exactly, and thank God for fake news and Trump, because that's only helped quality, and bloggers as well, quality journalism. But it is worth saying that younger people are also more likely to lapse, because they're also equally as adept at cancelling subscriptions. So those yearly terms and win back campaigns or engagement campaigns after people sign up are really important. And for those based in the UK, they'll be very used to getting an email from Sky saying what's coming up in the week and what they might have missed. That is exactly talking to that point where if you're emailing someone telling them what's coming up, what they've missed, and you can personalize that, they're much more likely to stay on your product. Because if you're thinking about canceling Sky, but they've just emailed you with something that you've watched or interested in, your propensity to lapse goes down massively.
That's interesting. There's also I guess there's a school of thought that says we should make it as hard as possible for people to leave. And you see this, some mobile phone operators, if you try and leave, they make it very hard. And you see this in some papers as well, some online products. And then the counter argument is other people say, well, let's make it super simple for people to cancel, super simple for people to join. And actually, they're more likely, even if they churn, they're more likely to rejoin because it wasn't a difficult experience to leave in the first place. Is that something you've come across?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we luckily had someone in marketing from the British Film Institute, and they found out by telling people that they were about to lapse and when they lapsed, and made it those people's problems, especially after the trial, that they felt responsible for their own subscription. And as soon as they felt that, they were less likely to lapse, more likely to control when and come back and not feel conned. Because, if you think of social economics, if you think you've been conned one time, you'll go out of your way not to do something the second time. So I'm much more in favor of allowing people to choose their own destiny, but prompting them on that journey about what's about to happen so they feel in control of it, not that they're being led by us.
Interesting. I'd just like to switch to the pandemic effect. I think we've been through one of the biggest sort of economic shocks of a generation recently. I think that I was looking at the figures earlier, I think print's down across the board 25%. That doesn't affect everybody equally. And advertising in particular, especially at the start of the pandemic, was hit quite hard. And as with various other models, I think that move to subscription has accelerated. I think in the UK, we saw roughly, as an estimate, 800,000 new subscribers during the pandemic. And I think the consensus is that we will see a shift perhaps back to some print, but I don't think we're going to go back to 2019 again. What's been your experience during this difficult time?
So it's all been positive in digital subscriptions, which is quite a weird thing to talk about COVID and positiveness in that, but it certainly has focused a lot of business owners' minds because it's accelerated the change that was already there in the market. Whilst looking at other businesses, there was and their subscriptions, there was always a bump around COVID, each one without fail. And whether they were trying to sell the business or talk about the business, you couldn't ignore the fact that their subscription graphs jumped up at that time. So digital editions saw an increase, and also digital subscriptions. And I think all it's doing is accelerating behavior in that way. So it's been a good thing for digital subscriptions, and it's really focused people's mind that actually newsstand has been in decline, print has always been in terminal decline, but this is what 5 years down the line might look like. Here's kind of a magnifying glass to that.
Yeah, and I think also it's highlighted that companies need to think about mixed revenue models as well. I think that even though I think page views were something up like 50% in the first few months of the pandemic, but actually, even though they were up by 50%, programmatic advertising was actually down in the same period. So it just shows how difficult, even if you double your page views, you're still losing money. It's a difficult equation. It's a slightly hard one to manage. So I think this sort of idea of these mixed models.
Yeah, and it's worth also saying in UK, the VAT laws changed right at the pandemic. So it was slightly blurred at the beginning, but suddenly you're having a 20% revenue uplift because VAT, suddenly it's not applicable to VAT on a subscription. So for me, it'd been running a paywall for a couple of years. Suddenly we're 20% higher. and we were seeing businesses come in that we were talking to, whether they want to sell it or not, suddenly, we're 20% up on revenue, we've increased our yield. Someone was telling porkies because they were taking the VAT lift off that and putting it straight to their bottom line, and they are quite a few times, but it was definitely a thing.
And of course, the marginal cost of managing a new subscriber is virtually nil versus a print subscriber. It's not huge, but there's obviously cost involved in that as well. I think the other thing, and this sort of brings me on to my next question, the other thing I think that suffered for some publishers is they were starting to offer B2B publishers have been doing this for a long time and building out the product beyond the content. So running events, and obviously event revenue for many publishers has declined for obvious reasons. And I think events probably will recover. What's your take on this sort of subscription versus membership, where in a membership, it's being you belong to that publication, you get other benefits beyond just access to the content. Is that something you've done?
As I said before, I think there's a social reason people sign up to a lot of brands, because they feel a part of it. One of the value exchanges we're testing on the eye is simply become part of our community, and people click on it because they feel loyal to that brand. And Decanter did events, and I can, as a tidbit, to just early release, they could sell out those events based on people who are subscribers to the premium service straight away, because they knew what they liked, they could segment them, they understood, and they were close to the brand, and they could sell out events. So when it moved into the pandemic, they could sell online masterclasses for 300 quid a ticket and sell them out without it ever going public. So you can start to see that membership coming through, and it's something that will work. There's apps, there's a lot more things coming online, and there's going to be things online in 5 years' time that we can't imagine now. And if you can start to create that as part of your feeling of longing to an organization, I do think membership will work. I know some people are against it, and for me, content is still king. That is the number one reason why anyone would ever subscribe. But value added and trying to work out what your value added to your audience are important. I think a lot of publishers look at ad light very quickly because it annoys the publishers or editors themselves, as you say that. But is that a value added in lots of people's mind? It did seem to be for Decanter, but it wasn't in the top 5. Interestingly, with good service.
I think generally speaking to our clients, the sort of ad light hasn't been a big driver for subscriptions. It seems to be a big thing in some countries, in Switzerland, for example, but in the UK, I don't think it's necessarily been a big driver. It's an interesting idea. I think some of this, as well as giving value add, I think it's trying to make the products a little bit stickier. I often think about the sort of the Amazon Prime. Who else can offer discounted sort of or next day shopping delivery with video, with music? It's a hard package to compete with, and all those benefits that they add obviously make it a stickier product as a result. Whereas if you broke it down into its individual components, you might drop one or move to another service, for example. So I think obviously some of it's about value add, but perhaps also about making it a stickier product as well.
Exactly, and that's one thing of saying that all the features, it's the never-ending cycle. Like the more features you can start to do, you've got a reason to contact, you've got an evolution of the product. So it's not, whilst the cost of people are less to acquire new readers, the more value added you can get, the better it is for the product. So you see the FT with my FT, but Decanter, we decided to create a mini seller, because we realized that if people start adding wines to that cellar and they lapse, they've got their collection and they lose it. So it's quite a powerful retention tool.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Interesting. And I think that sort of leads on to this app versus web. I mean, I remember when the iPad came out, I was heavily involved in helping publishers, move their publications to the iPad and sort of create these interactive digital editions. And the iPad was going to be the savior of the publishing industry, and it would replace print, etc. The reality wasn't quite it didn't quite match that promise. I think apps still have a place. Well, where do you see the role of apps versus web in sort of work you've done?
So I joined the publishing world just as that was being streamlined when basically a PDF of the print product wasn't the savior. But you could imagine if you were a print editor, why you think that might be the case. And actually, we had most success for people who couldn't get the print product and therefore would then download the app to use it. So hence why in COVID, you saw an increase in digital edition products, especially with older people who suddenly worked out, oh, I can use an iPhone or an iPad because I don't want to go to the shop. So I think it is very much I call it a lean back experience, a digital edition. And then some other apps have a much more dip in, dip out. So a mobile version of the web, but with added extras. So for me and other publications, brand loyalty comes first. The app is a value added later. Because if you think about how you surf, not many people go straight to an app without having already engaged with the brand. And even then, and I know there's a good piano model there, most people are more likely, even though they go on the mobile phone, to pay for something on their desktop computer. And that's still the case now. So at Decanter, we could get a certain amount of people to download an app. And we saw this play out because as I joined DMG, they created a lot of apps, but not many people were downloading it. And the same thing was playing out where they'd created the app first rather than the experience and the brand first before pushing people to an app.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And I think the problem with apps is a lot of it's around that discoverability. It's hard to discover an app. A lot of people won't, as you say, unless they're already engaged to that brand, they're not going to go out of their way and download it. Whereas obviously, if you have that web presence as well, you can be exposed to search. It's easy to link from social media, easy for other publications to link. You can got paid search. You know, there was an initiative to make sort of app content more searchable through the App Store, but it never really worked properly, and I don't think it definitely hasn't replaced. So
exactly.
Acquisition.
The big winners in the App Store were, the people, the first movers, the people who had the apps in a long time ago, established brands, and have downloaded, and people have built those habits. But as new movers, it's much harder to break into the App Store. If you look at the top 100 grossing apps, you're looking at games, dating sites, and streaming services, which people have already heard of. So to come as a publishing first model there, it would be much harder to break in.
Yeah, interesting. Which brings me on to my last question, I guess. What's your take on news aggregators? There's been certainly, I've seen various attempts to create news aggregator services to either offer it as free or offer it as a premium service. Have you had much involvement in them, and where do you see those playing? Do you think there's a role for those sorts of services?
I've certainly been approached by them quite a few times. I haven't rushed into it, mainly because the revenue we generated, the sort of size of audience you'd have to get to generate any revenue was non-achievable. And I fundamentally didn't understand, can you guys pay for the content, create the brand, and we'll take it free of charge virtually? And then we started to play with putting in possible messaging to subscription paywalls, events, which had uptake. There was uptake. But was it enough for the effort? If you did a pure return on investment, not really. So for me, news aggregators, the winners are the aggregators themselves. The losers are the people who foot the bill. And unfortunately, that was where I was footing the bill.
And I think also you often lose contact with that customer, and often with the data. And we haven't really talked about data in this session, but data obviously in understanding content consumption, understanding how customers are behaving, how you can acquire them is crucial, from everything to the type of content you write to the pricing strategies you put in place. And obviously going through these aggregators can be very challenging because you don't have direct contact with those clients. So
exactly, and you especially even in an app, if they go directly and pay directly, it's quite hard to get those people's data. So in a world where cookies are changing, GDPR laws are changing, you really do want first-party data, because whether your pay will last or not, that is going to be the cornerstone of any successful publishing house going forward.
Exactly, and my hope, and I can see this happening, is actually the power is going to shift back towards the publishers, and the publishers being able to gather their own data, use their own data for either targeting purposes or for advertising purposes. It puts them back in the driving seat, and away from programmatic advertising. So actually, I think it's good news on a number of fronts, I think. Not to say there won't be challenges, but I think there's opportunity as well. Thank you so much, Harry. I'd just like to hand back to James and see if we've got any questions.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you, Harry, for a very entertaining and interesting chat. We have had an absolute ton of questions. I don't know how we're going to answer them all. We've had 15, and they're all good ones. So I really want to try and answer all of them. Let me start straight away then with the first one at the top, the most voted for question, which is, how can an organization onboard new subscribers and get them excited and engaged with their new subscription? Harry, I guess that's one for you.
I think, as Rupert said, the more you engage with them, there's different studies where some people say leave them alone, some people say bombard them. But ultimately, if you target them with value added over the time to remind them why they signed up and to start to interact with your brand, that's the strongest way. So some of the things we're playing with at the IR, setting newsletter preference centers, a specialist newsletter straight to them, just reiterating that there's less ads, part of a community, starting to talk about those value exchanges that you understand, and then just rounding it up with the best content from the week. This is why you signed up, you already like the brand, and here is a reminder about why we're good. And I think that helps stick in that time.
Fabulous. A question here about the Apple iOS update. This is from Rosa Sherwood. Rosa, thank you for your question. How do you think the new Apple iOS update will impact subscription models, particularly for companies who rely on email for their customer communications? Who wants to take that?
I'm happy to have a stab at that one. I guess this is to do with the anonymizing of perhaps email addresses, and not being able. I mean, as long as if the customer has that email address and they're logging in, if you can encourage them to log in, then we can create a profile for them. The fact whether it's an anonymized email address or not, I guess doesn't matter, as long as we have that unique identifier, and you can then create. You can start using some personalization or some of the things that Harry talked about. I think it's about giving people a reason to create that account, whether it's an element of personalization or an element of storing your preferences or your settings, and encouraging them to go down that route. I think Apple do obviously present some challenges around how they prevent analytics or prevent some of the tracking, and it can be a challenge, and I think a lot of this can be solved by the drive towards getting people to register and move from anonymous to known.
And it also, so I was going to say, from a marketing point of view, that definitely that losing 40 to 70% of your analytics on your pixel for remarketing, it has massive problems there. So you start to look more at the UTM trackings on the other side of it. So it's going to be an issue. And I know people at Facebook themselves in their marketing department are struggling with it. So they'll have to come up with a solution.
Yeah. Relating to the App Store, another question here from Lara Thompson. Lara, thank you for your question. She says, is it worth looking into App Store optimization when launching an app? And she says, also, thank you very much for this in-depth and really interesting chat. Well, thank you, Lara, for that feedback. Harry, what do you think about that? Is App Store optimization?
So, there's lots of companies who offer such services. But as I said with Rupert, DMG did go down the App Store first, but the number of people to go to the App Store, unless you're specifically driving that, is very few. So for me, it's quite high up on the tree in terms of hanging fruit, to put it that way. On the App Store, 90% are brand terms to download the app, and then you have to rank in the top 4 for other terms. So unless you can intercept on those top 4, especially, I don't know what the brand is, depending on the startup and the volume, it's going to be a very hard sell straight away, and you need a lot to invest. So I would actually try and get the mobile and desktop experiences sorted first, in order of priority.
Yeah, a bit further down the list of things to do. I've got a couple of questions here on registration that I'm going to combine into one. So the first question is from John Wilpers. What have you found to be the best incentive to get people to register? And then Rosa Sherwood asking, how do you encourage users to become registered customers when your account benefits might be initially quite limited and not a selling point to the user, focused more on serving personalized content with audience behaviors? Rupert, do you want to lead on that one? And then we'll ask Harry.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest incentive is some access to premium content. A lot of publishers have made the switch away from maybe giving metered access to anonymous users and actually saying this is our most premium content. You have to register to be able to get access to that. The other sort of strategy that's very common is sort of access to commenting, for example. If you want to comment, you need to register, and obviously things like email newsletters as well. I think those are the sort of the top strategies for driving registration.
Harry?
Yeah, and I'd say on we're only two weeks into the launch, but we're certainly seeing content being king still, newsletters being up there as a reason to subscribe and basically to start to clean up your journey, because one of Piano's data scientists will always say, if you don't ask, you don't get. So if you just ask someone to register, quite a few people do register, really.
Yeah, and reducing the friction as well. So again, just because the marketing team want to get your favorite color and your last 4 addresses doesn't mean you should ask that at registration time. Try and reduce the friction down and make it super easy. We have things like passwordless registration where the customer just puts an email address in to create an account, and those sorts of strategies can really help conversion.
Yeah, I'm certainly, from FIPP's own experience as well, we've put in a registration wall on our site, and putting carefully selected content behind that registration wall has generated enormous numbers. I mean, much bigger numbers than we ever thought would be possible for a relatively small trade association. So content seems to be king, as it is with many things. Let's do another one here, Harry, for you on metrics, and then perhaps, Rupert, you can chip in on this afterwards with a view from across the industry. So Harry, when you outside of subscriber numbers, which are the metrics that are most important on your organizational dashboard to measure the success of your subs models?
So it depends on the maturity of the product. Is the very kind of short answer, because Rupert talked about if people are sleepers and they're not logging in, that is a sure sign that they are not going to come back and they're not going to pay. So intercepting them that's an important dashboard. But for me, if you're in startup mode, is getting the editorial teams on board with not page views, but when people are taking certain actions against their content. So some people might build out a scoring model, but this could be against how many times a person has come back within a certain day period, depending on your publishing model, how much time they spent on site during that time, and try and wean them off page views, which is sometimes quite hard in a digital part. And then once you've got registrations, create a scoreboard on registrations, subscriptions against content types, authors, etc., to try and get the editorial team into that. And the same with performance marketing as well. Start to track them on, instead of top level visits, very performance based, how people act on site as their goals, and just changing that whole mindset against that whole digital publishing model.
Rupert, your view on metrics across the piece?
Yeah, I'd echo what Harry says. I think there are also some basic things like the sort of frequency and recency measures, looking how often people are coming back, the frequency, the number of articles. Those sorts of measures are very important to understand the behavior on site, help to sort of understand as well around churn propensity. I think they're things to look at as well. Some headline metrics there.
Okay, another question here for both of you from Rachel Arthur, Rachel of Boom Saloon, the independent media brand. What's the most interesting and engaging facet of membership outside of content that you've seen implemented? So any things that you've come across as membership benefits that are interesting and engaging?
We work with a publication called Tortoise Media in the UK. They have they have a whole range of memberships. You get sort of notebook with your own name on it and everything else, a whole package of benefits. And they do these interesting think-ins, slightly different take on events. They're much smaller, they're much more discussion based, and they're very regional as well. So trying to get away from a lot of the sort of London centric events that we have and have them in different regions. And I really like their take on that. But again, very much all around membership and driving that engagement and that belonging, that sentiment of belonging, and trying to be part of the discussion, not just sat on the outside of it. And that was perhaps one of the more innovative approaches I saw.
Harry, have you come across?
Yeah, so we did events as well, and they've done really well. But also, as I said before, storing your wine against your account, suddenly there's a reason to subscribe. And I would look at hotels, people like Soho House and membership models, things that they do are very applicable to this kind of service. So membership discounts. Okay, you can get this discount if you're a member. Here's a list of benefits that you might have that your biggest advertisers, suddenly they can't reach these people, but you could have a discount to their product if you sign up. Amex loyalty program is a lovely place to look to work out what they could do and how you could start to do that, specialist for memberships. And that feels like only they are getting in and it's exclusive, and the wording around that can be pretty good on that.
Yeah, I think there's lots to be learned actually by looking outside of the media industry and see if we can take ideas from other sectors. It's a good point.
Yeah, definitely looking at subscription boxes and all sorts of other interesting models that are out there. Last question, because we're nearly running out of time. So let's take the last question from Edmund Davison. Edmund, thank you for your question. Who's asking, and I think probably this is referring to your slides at the beginning, Rupert. Can you talk a little bit more about free trial for monthly versus discount for annual, and just expand on that a little bit?
Yes, we typically find that there's not a huge amount of benefit to offering trials for annual products, and if you are going to offer trials, put them on the monthly. Those people, get them to sample and then try and upsell them to annual. And then if you are likewise, if you're offering discount codes, promo codes, those sorts of things, try and use those against annual products. Try and obviously do seasonality on your campaigns. Don't have a campaign all the time, then you're just devaluing the value of the product. But try and do those discounts, those promotions on the annual, because we want to drive people towards annual. And think about whether you want to offer those discounts on the monthly. But we would recommend doing them on maybe 6-month or the annual products. And talking about the trials again, you can do the free trials, but typically if you do a low monetary value, £1, €1, $1, then they actually generate more revenue in the long term for you, even if the uptake wouldn't be that high. It's showing a level of commitment as part of that particular flow. So those are the sorts of things we would recommend. There are more in-depth, if you look at our and I think we're showing this report, there's a lot more in-depth onto that distinction between free trial, paid trial, annual as well, and you'll see some real metrics as well on that. So there's a lot more detail on our website in our report.
Yeah, I've just reposted that into the chat there. It's the last message on the chat, so you can go in and have a look at Piano's report. We're out of time. Gents, thank you very much for taking the time. Harry, appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights from DMG. And Rupert, thank you very much for taking the time to be our interviewer for today and also for sharing Piano's insights. It was a really great session.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
For those of you who are watching, thank you very much for doing so. Please do remember to sign up to the FIPP newsletter if you get the chance to do so at fipp.com. If you're particularly interested in the New Zealand market, we're running a FIPP Insider next week for New Zealand, featuring some international speakers and some local speakers from New Zealand. It will mean you have to get up in the middle of the night to watch it, but it's definitely worth it in terms of the content. So please do look out for information on that in the newsletter. If not, then you'll be able to see this video on our YouTube channel. A reminder that our YouTube channel is called FIPP World. You can find not only this video, but videos of all the webinars we've run over the last 18 months. There are an enormous number on a great variety of subjects. I hope you find them useful. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. And it only remains for me to say thank you to our guests once again, to Rupert and to Harry, and to say thank you very much for watching and goodbye. Goodbye.